In February of 2014, I called home, and my mom answered, "Hi, what's new with you?" And I had this simultaneously thrilling and terrifying experience of saying to her, "Please don't freak out, but I'm getting arrested next weekend." And she says that her first thought was, how could my straight arrow, rule-follower daughter decide that she's intentionally going to get herself arrested? And then she said her second thought was, what if something goes wrong and she gets hurt? And then her third thought was, oh my God, she's going to have an arrest record. And then her fourth thought was, she's going to have to put that she's been arrested on her job applications. And so, of course, she tried to talk me out of it. And I had conveniently forgotten this part a whole year and a half later, but she recently reminded me that during this whole debate, I said something to the effect of, "Mom, I'm not entirely sure that I'm asking your permission," which I'm pretty sure is the most rebellious thing I ever said to my mother. And so I tell you this story to give you some context about the kinds of reactions I get from people when I tell them that not only have I been arrested, but I intentionally got arrested. In March of 2014, I participated in a nonviolent direct action against the Keystone XL Pipeline, which is a tar sands pipeline that runs from the Alberta region of Canada through the middle of the United States and down to refineries on the Gulf Coast. Along with 400 other college students, I zip-tied myself to the fence surrounding the White House in protest of the pipeline. And after about 6 hours, was cut down from the fence, handcuffed, and processed at the Anacostia police facility. And even though it's been a year and a half, I generally get one of two reactions from people when I tell them this story. They either say, "Oh, wow, that's awesome," or they say, "You're never going to get a job." And so today I want to talk to you about what brought me to the decision that getting arrested was the right thing to do, and why civil disobedience is such a powerful democratic tool. When I first decided to get arrested, many of my peers shied away from the idea of directing this activism into a legal confrontation. Why is breaking the law the way to get things done? Chaining yourself to a fence doesn't do anything. Breaking the law to pursue justice is pretty much the definition of paradoxical. So many people asked us why we didn't pursue classic democratic tactics, like writing letters or op-eds, or meeting with elected officials. But the thing is, many of those things had already happened. Anti-Keystone activists had been doing that work in the several years since the pipeline had been proposed. But they had generally found themselves powerless in the face of large corporate interests like TransCanada, the company trying to build the pipeline. And it was this feeling of being unheard that was making me all the angrier at the situation. Even worse, many of the people fighting the pipeline are indigenous peoples, whose sacred land and water would be polluted or destroyed if the Keystone Pipeline were to be built. And as you might imagine if you've ever taken US history, many of these people have not had the best luck dealing with the US government. And so it wasn't out of the blue that a bunch of activists decided that the only thing left to do was to put our physical bodies in the way and decide not to move, even if it meant the risk of arrest. A young woman came to one of our Georgetown Fossil free meetings and asked if anyone was interested in getting arrested at a protest against the Keystone Pipeline. Proud and mighty activist that I was, I raised my hand, having absolutely no idea what I was getting into. And so it was about this time that people began knowing that my fellow activist, Chloe Lazarus, and I were planning on being arrested at an environmental protest the following weekend. And it was also about this time that I realized that this wasn't a very Georgetown thing to do. So the day before the arrest, which was a Saturday, I woke up absolutely terrified. Tomorrow, I thought, I'm getting arrested tomorrow. and I began to feel like I was walking to my death. And even worse, I had mountains of homework that I desperately needed to do, but I could not for the life of me concentrate. And I began to just have to accept that it wasn't going to get done. One thing I want to make sure that I explain to you is that we didn't just hop up on the fence and decide to get arrested. We had a comprehensive training the day before. And so Chloe and I trekked to a small church where we joined about 400 other college students, many of whom were a lot like yourselves, sitting on the floor as other activists and organizers, adults, stood at the periphery. And the organizer asked if any of us had been arrested for peaceful protests before. And most of the college students did not raise their hands. But most of the adults in the back of the room did. Twice, he asked, and the hands stayed up. 3 times, 4, 5, and he kept counting, and the hands kept staying up. And he counted up to something like 12 arrests, and we all began applauding because we were in the midst of arrest veterans, people who had done this before and seen positive results, and were still here to tell the tale. So the organizer opened it up to a question and answer session, and most of the questions were about what you would expect. Until one very brave student raised his hand and asked, "Am I at risk for a more difficult arrest process because I'm Black?" And the organizer pursed his lips in sympathy and said, "We have to remember that there's a fair amount of privilege in this process. Just by virtue of being able to pay our own bail and to have this on our records, and knowing pretty well that we'll return safe at the end of the day. To answer your question more directly, we'll have support staff around you and lawyers in case anything goes wrong. I don't think it will, but we have to remember that this process is not colorblind." I had never associated the words privilege and arrest before. And as the organizer ended the training, he said, "It's okay if you're nervous, pre-action jitters. But you know what? You will get addicted to that feeling." Many Georgetown students awoke the next day, a cloudy Sunday in March, to several hundred people in Red Square here at Georgetown beginning a protest against the Keystone Pipeline. And it was amazing that since activists had come from as far as Vermont and Texas in order to be at this protest, all I had to do was walk out of my dorm to be in the midst of it. And it was at Georgetown because President Obama had given a speech about climate change here the summer before. And so organizers decided that we would walk from Georgetown University, past Secretary John Kerry's house, and towards the White House, where we would create a giant oil spill out of a large black tarp, and then die on top of it. So the energy in Red Square was absolutely contagious, and it's easier to show you than to tell you.
President Obama! President Obama! What you gonna do? What you gonna do? President Obama! President Obama! What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Gonna stop this pipeline! 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 What you gonna do? That's what you gotta do! No KXL! No KXL!
And it was surreal for the streets to be completely blocked off so that more than 1,000 people could march through the neighborhood of Georgetown towards 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The police, having been notified beforehand that we were on our way, were already there with barricades, police cars, buses, and lots of handcuffs. After brief speeches from organizers and frontline communities, those of us risking arrest walked towards the fence. And about 50 students, these fellows in hazmat suits, died on top of the tarp, while the other 350 of us began zip tying ourselves to the fence. And we spanned almost the entire thing, but even so, we were clustered so close together that we were practically on top of each other. Chloe and I tightened each other's zip ties and began chanting with everyone else. Protesters who weren't risking arrest backed up as the police began to rope off the area. And in case you're wondering, you have to have a special permit in order to occupy this postcard area in front of the White House if you're going to be there for more than a couple of minutes. And it's not exactly legal to zip tie yourself to the fence either. And so police roped off the area and gave us 3 warnings over a megaphone. Protesters who do not leave the area immediately will be placed under arrest. And we cheered in response. So police began arresting the people on the tarp and then moved to those of us on the fence. And they were arresting about 1 person every minute, which sounds fast until you remember that there were 400 of us. And so this process took several hours. And it was about 3 hours in that my mother tells me that the cameras that had been covering the action disappeared as the temperature plummeted from a balmy 50 degrees to below freezing, and it began to sleet. So it was about 6 hours later that Chloe and I were finally cut down from the pipeline, numbers 340 and 343 respectively. So we were handcuffed, put in the police car, and spent about 3 hours at the Anacostia Park Police Facility paying our bail. And I won't kid you, those 6 hours on the fence were pretty damn miserable. Not least because of the sleet, but also because my arm and shoulder hurt from holding it in this one position for 6 hours. And I was so hungry. And so finally, as I said, we were handcuffed and put in police cars, and I learned that the fastest way to get around DC is in handcuffs in the back of a speeding police car. And we spent about 3 hours waiting in line, paying our bail, and getting back to Georgetown. The day after the arrest, I thought I would feel elated, but I felt horrible. It had been a really emotional experience being with this many people who cared so deeply about this issue. I was also exhausted and kind of sick because the day before the protest, I had intentionally dehydrated myself, knowing that I wouldn't have access to a bathroom for more than 12 hours. I got calls from people checking on me and congratulating me, but I also got aggressive messages from people both here and at home in Georgia. One kid that I didn't even know posted a comment on a photo of my arrest ticket on Facebook. And what he said was so profane and disturbing that a Southern girl simply can't repeat it. So I was getting a lot of mixed messages, to be sure. Mixed messages about the worth of what I'd done and if it would have any effect. Mixed messages about having an arrest on my record. And mixed messages about whether we would win. And so the day after this, my sadness and apprehension finally began to recede and turned into reflection about why I had chosen to do what I did and why it was such a privilege to be there that day. This photo requires a little bit of explanation because it's kind of confusing when you see it. This was actually taken by the official White House photographer from within the White House. And those are many of our little arms reaching on the inside, zip-tied to the fence for 6 hours. And I think it's a pretty poignant representation of awaiting arrest. But the thing is, getting arrested was never an end in and of itself. In some cases of civil disobedience, like that of Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., people break the law in order to show that the law itself is unjust. In our case, we wanted to create an image, a giant oil spill in front of the White House, that would be so large, so unmistakable, and so simply in the way, that getting arrested was probably going to be inevitable. In other words, we didn't want to get arrested. We wanted to make our point, that this pipeline was dangerous and would be a point of shame for the Obama administration. The point that my fellow student had brought up about his vulnerability in this action as a person of color highlights some of the privileges of going into an action like this. The day before the arrest, I was definitely anxious, but when I was on the fence, I was never scared, because I knew that I would return safely home to Georgetown at the end of the night. And so I couldn't help but think of places where there are real revolutions occurring, places where people understand that they can face imprisonment, violence, or even death because they choose to speak out. My dad likes to differentiate between countries where you have freedom of speech and places where you have freedom after speech. And I knew that my right to free speech was protected, even though I was risking arrest, and that I would return home at the end of the day. The policeman who cut me down from the fence said, "Do I hear a bit of Georgia in your voice?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm from Atlanta." And he said, "Oh, I'm from Savannah." And this is all while he's putting me into handcuffs. And so I understand that my experience being arrested was different from what many experience as a broken criminal justice system in the United States. When I got to the processing facility, I was ready to surrender $50. Ordinarily, the bail for this offense is $100, but the park police gave us a group rate. And I knew that I'd be welcomed by support staff and allowed to go home. Using civil disobedience as a democratic tactic is a privilege. And it took a while, but we're finally seeing some of the positive effects of activism like this against the Keystone Pipeline. Just to give you an example, the media really mattered. Compared to large non-arrest rallies before it, XL Dissent received 10 times more media coverage. There are rallies at the White House pretty much every day, but when a student dressed like Captain Planet was caught on camera being handcuffed at XL Dissent, I'd like to think that maybe President Obama and Secretary Kerry may have noticed. When this pipeline was first proposed, its supporters thought it was a surefire yes from the US government. But when activists came against the pipeline with resounding dissent, everything changed. And today, environmental groups are predicting that within the next few weeks, the White House will issue an official rejection of the Keystone XL Pipeline. But of course, XL Dissent was not the only action that created this anticipated result. It was one snowflake among many op-eds, many letters, many rallies, many meetings, many arrests that piled onto the tree branch slowly but surely until the branch finally bent and broke. And it's for this reason that I will never know if my arrest mattered. But that's the thing, is you'll rarely know if your individual action matters. We have to rely on the collective buildup of snow, the collective buildup of each of our little individual snowflakes of action in order to make the branch break. Using civil disobedience as a democratic tactic is a privilege. We have been born into a country where we have that privilege to protest and to risk arrest, and it is imperative that we use it. When I see my arrest ticket hanging on my wall, I see a risk that has empowered me to know that even without money or political clout, I always have democratic power. Risking arrest is a way to participate in democracy and to honor the law. And for me, this was a risk worth taking. Thank you.